to be strong. It hasn't been easy to stay positive.
Canada's First Nations and Native Americans in the United States have much higher rates of suicide than non-Indigenous people in these two countries. The suicide epidemic came to light this month as one tribe in Ontario, Canada, saw 11 suicide attempts in one evening. We begin with this report from CCTV's Sean Callebs.
There are wonderful experiences in Canada's Indigenous communities. Such as the drum dance during the annual Spring Festival in Inuvik, above the Arctic Circle in the nation's Northwest Territories.
Oh, I enjoyed it with my whole heart and soul. It's a healing tool for me.
Healing is a word often floating around First Nation communities in Canada. Poverty, housing concerns, little hope for economic improvement help fuel drug and alcohol addiction. And there are thousands of Indigenous people in Canada, like Gordon Rubin, coping with the traumatic after effects of what is known as residential schooling.
They were sexually abused, they were beaten, they were starved. Things of that nature are just the beginning of it.
Residential schooling started in the late 1800s in Canada. Indigenous children were taken from their families, forbidden to practice their culture or speak their language. Abuse was rampant among the 150,000 or so children victimized, and some 6,000 died before the schools were abandoned in the 1990s.
When you've been to a residential school yourself, it's hard for you to, when you don't realize it, you impose those actions onto your children.
This cycle of trauma has in part led to what Canada's government is calling a crisis of suicides in Indigenous communities.
We have an awful lot of work to do as a country to renew the relationship, to start offering full respect to Indigenous Canadians.
Prime Minister Trudeau wants to spend some $6.5 billion in the next 5 years in Indigenous regions on health care, infrastructure, and in an effort to give people hope. Trudeau says young activists are engaged and ready to build.
Even after all the disrespect and all the terrible things that the Canadian government has been complicit in over the past generations, are ready to work with the Canadian government to start solving these very, very real challenges.
This action is long overdue, according to many. Canada's health minister points out that while the Indigenous people make up only about 4% of Canada's population, their suicide rate is nearly 10 times higher than Canada's general youth population. Sean Callebs, CCTV in Washington.
Joining me now from Toronto, Dawn Lavell-Harvard is president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. With me in the studio, Denise Desiderio is policy director of the National Congress of American Indians. In Ottawa, Cindy Blackstock is executive director of Five Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. And Teddy McCullough is a policy fellow for the Centre for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Cindy, let me start with you. We're looking at some shocking figures there. You know, as we've been reporting, in one small community of just 2,000 people, there have been 100 suicide attempts since September. Now, I know this is a broad question, but can you pin the reasons for this?
Well, not only is it the multi-generational impacts of residential school that you talked about, but what a lot of your viewers may not know is that the federal government provides funding for all social services and education for children on reserve, whereas the provinces, equivalent to your states, provide it for all other Canadians. And the federal government of Canada has known for the last 16 years that it underfunds these services significantly. And these underfunded services cut across all dimensions of children's childhood. They get about 30% less for education, 30% less for child welfare, less healthcare services, and less access to mental health. And the most tragic thing about these inequalities is that children don't know that the federal government is shortchanging them. So they start to internalize these inequalities, their inability to succeed on the same terms as other kids, as a personal and cultural deficit. And then when they start feeling badly about themselves, there aren't the array of mental health services available to other Canadians. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, in fact, just this last January, issued a judgment against the federal government calling this underfunding of child and family services to be systemic racial discrimination by the Canadian government and ordered it to stop. And although there was an immediate order for them to stop, they haven't. And so today, the tribunal issued a further order, much more detailed, requiring the federal government to end these inequalities and give these kids a shot at a fair childhood.
Denise, we know that these situations, these conditions exist in the United States as well. Are the causes very similar?
They are. In fact, what we were just hearing about the chronic underfunding is something that the United States government is looking at again through the United States Commission on Civil Rights. We have a report that's coming out this spring called the Quiet Crisis Report, and it attacks not only the healthcare issues in Native America and the chronic underfunding of those, but education, economic development, the lack of economic development opportunities on United States reservations, and across the board, the underfunding that has occurred in the federal government that really, like you heard, it kind of makes us the invisible nations in the United States. Conditions exist in our communities that if they were elsewhere, there would just be outrage. For example, the Flint, Michigan example. Right. The whole United States is outraged at the situation in Flint, Michigan that happened because of the infrastructure deficits there, and they should be. It's not acceptable that children are drinking water, contaminated with lead. But those conditions have existed in tribal communities in the United States for decades. And our youth internalize that, and they think, well, why is it outrageous when someone else has that condition? What about us? And that's the beginning of the less than. And that's what causes youth to feel kind of despair and that their lives aren't as important as those of other communities.
Teddy, I said the figures are shocking, but even more disturbing when we look at suicide rates is the number of young people who are not only committing suicide, but attempting suicide, some as young as 10 years old. Why young people?
I think for the most part, young people, as Denise was talking about, we really internalize that a lot more. Our minds are still developing. Teenagers, normal teenagers, when their parents are yelling at them, they think the world is all against them. They're still in that state of mind, so they're more susceptible to any of these negative connotations. And when you have racism in your schools and bullying in your schools, and when you have a healthcare system, not only a lack of mental health services, but also a lack of quality healthcare, quality education. You go into a school, the chances that you're going to graduate are very slim. In some communities, you have a 20% graduation rate, that low. And when you're faced with that kind of these negative statistics, what hope is there? And the only thing, that we can connect with is our culture and our traditions when we have nothing else.
Dawn, when we look at the suicide rates and the number of people attempting to commit suicide, what kind of impact does it have on Native Canadian communities?
This is the biggest tragedy that we face because tragically with our young people, when they're looking around the communities and they see that they're living in third world conditions, they're living in communities with no clean water, no housing, with no hydro, no schools, no employment. The despair really settles in, and because they don't see any hope for any kind of future for themselves, that's when the suicide pacts kick in. That's when these young people just see no reason to continue. The biggest tragedy is that there's a ripple effect, because if the young people are already struggling with depression, struggling with suicidal thoughts, when one does commit suicide, those who are left behind to grieve that loss are even more likely to feel that they have no reason to go on, because now, in addition to their depression, they're having to cope with the additional grief of losing a loved one. And this can become contagious in communities, especially among the young people, as they're coping with the deaths of more and more of their loved ones. And that's why communities like Attawapiskat are in such crisis.
Cindy, as we heard in that report there, the Canadian Prime Minister, the relatively new Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying that an awful lot of work needs to be done. He is, in fact, within a few hours, meeting with First Nation leaders in Canada to discuss the challenges facing Native Canadians. What are your hopes for this kind of meeting?
Well, what we want to see is an end to this racial discrimination as fiscal policy, particularly for children. The current budget announced by the new government provides funding, but over a 5-year period. And for child and family services and for education, the vast majority of that money does not come for 4 or 5 years out. And that means a lot for the life of a child. Children don't have incremental childhoods. They need that opportunity right now, especially in cases of suicide. So I want to see them do that, and also invest in culture and language services for First Nations children, because we know from good research here in Canada that culture and language and attachment to their community and lands are huge protective factors against youth suicide. That and quality and culturally based mental health services.
And you think this new government under Justin Trudeau is going to hear these pleas that are being made? Are they going to respond to these challenges?
Well, I think that we have to wait and see. What I feel confident about is at least we have the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, which is a binding court authority in our country, ordering them to fix it. So it takes it out of the hands of their discretion and makes them do the right thing for kids. So I'm hoping we'll see follow-up on that order very quickly.
All right, and Denise, if we look at the situation here in the United States, if we sort of look at the national scale of priorities for this country. I mean, we hear a lot about, healthcare in general. We hear a lot about building walls to keep illegal immigrants out. We hear a lot about keeping Muslims out and things like that. On the national scale of priorities, where does the welfare of Native Americans fall?
I think that's a good question, and it's something, we have elections coming up, and you talk about the priorities, and what we're looking for to hear out of the candidates is where are they going to put the First Americans. We often, as I mentioned earlier, we often feel like the invisible society. Things that happen in other communities happen in our communities, but the attention isn't there. And that's why programs like this are really great, because we can kind of communicate the needs of Native Americans. But, we need more than promises. It's really time that the gap is starting to really affect our communities, the healthcare gap, the education gap, the workforce gap, in a way that we're just being left behind in ways that it's going to be really hard for us to recover from if we don't have serious action at the federal level and at the tribal level. One thing I would say is tribal governments always talk to us at NCI, and we don't think the federal government is the answer. If the federal government were the answer, the failed policies would not be still impacting us. And tribes are really saying to the government, like, give us the resources we need, and then let us do what needs to be done to help our future leaders. Because when you're talking about this crisis of youth in Native America, it's like nobody has more invested than tribal communities, and they're the future of our communities, and we're more invested in seeing them succeed than anyone. We're just asking for the resources and the tools to, like was mentioned, provide the culturally based solutions that exist in tribal communities.